the end of Daniel's memoirs, we need to remember that he's been a kidnap victim most of his life. And even though he's lived in this pagan land, he's never fully acclimated. He is still a lover of the one true God at heart. The exile is over, and many of his friends, fellow Jews, have gone back to their homeland to rebuild Jerusalem. And yet he's probably too old. In fact, he well may be around 90 at this point. He's probably not in the best of health, probably not strong enough to travel back to his homeland or to help with the rebuilding of his homeland. And yet, he probably is hearing of the struggles and the hindrances and the problems that they're having back there as they're attempting to rebuild the temple. And I wonder if we're not seeing in this chapter a bit of Daniel's humanity, because he seems to be a bit overwhelmed with grief. I wonder if as he's hearing the news of all of their struggles, he's not questioning God a little bit. He's wondering, is God going to right these many wrongs now that they've finally been allowed to go home, now that the discipline for their disobedience is over? He enters into a 3-week season of intense prayer and mourning and fasting. And at the end of those 3 probably miserable weeks, God does something amazing. He pulls back the veil that gives Daniel a glimpse of what is happening in the supernatural world, in the spiritual world, in the heavenly realms, as all of these other things are going on earth. The entry into his journal here in the chapter we're studying this week absolutely terrifies him initially. And when he gains his senses, he then writes down some of the specifics, what he sees and what he learns. And it's amazing what we see. It's just glimpses. Now we need to be careful and not extrapolate too much, because we're seeing through a glass dimly, but we do have a peek into the realms where we very seldom get to see some of the things going on that we see in this chapter. We learn that there are supernatural beings who are fighting on behalf of human kingdoms and governments, that they have names and ranks, and some of them are even representing particular governments. We see how God deeply is so involved in this warfare, and that there are angels that are fighting on behalf of people who love God. We see that they are working through what's going on in history. And I don't know about you, but as I often look at human history and governments, and particularly those governments that stand against God, I think of the Soviet Union during the communist years, and North Korea and Syria, and those countries that martyr Christians. I often don't really think of that in terms of spiritual warfare. But this chapter shows us that that's what's going on. Now we have to be careful when we think that way to realize that Ephesians 6 tells us that we need to pray for leaders, because the war is not against flesh and blood. And so we need to pray for these leaders. But indeed, all of this is part of what God is actually doing. Daniel is reminding us that we're not alone in these big conflicts or the small ones in our own life. Ultimately, we see through what we learn that God is moving history toward a sure and final end that is just the way He wants it to be. Daniel 10 is one of these incredible Bible passages where we get a glimpse into these unseen mysteries. So I want to encourage you to savor this text, to wring it out, because you're going to learn mysteries and get a glimpse into what God is doing that you can't see anywhere else. As we move into our last lesson, it's somewhat a continuation of what's going on in this week's lesson. You're going to learn more about the content of Daniel's vision. You're going to see him continue to interact with these heavenly creatures. And you're going to add more puzzle pieces to your prophetic puzzle, which helps you trust in the sovereignty of God.